Okay, I think we can start. So welcome everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Marlies de Jong and I'm currently the Head of Consulting at ProjectLink. I'm involved in the day-to-day coordination and integration of quantitative risk assessments.
Good afternoon everybody, my name is Werner Meyer and I'm also part of the consulting team at ProjectLink. And the idea behind the session this afternoon is to discuss some of the typical questions that we get from clients when we do quantitative risk assessments. And there are frequently specific questions that they ask us about industries, about the methods we use and so on. And the idea then would be to have a bit of a discussion around that and to just inform people about the way we do quantitative risk assessments and the benefits they can get from performing quantitative risk assessments as opposed to qualitative risk assessments. So between Marlies and I, there are a few topics we're going to discuss. There's always also the opportunity to ask some questions, and those questions, as you can see on the screen, can go into the question box. And yes, we're looking forward to talking to you, and we're also looking forward to some of the questions that you're going to hopefully ask us. So I think to start off with, I know there are perhaps quite a few people on this webinar who have not worked with quantitative risk assessments, who have not performed quantitative risk assessments. And I'm going to ask Marlies just to give us a brief introduction to explain what quantitative risk assessments are and how they differ from the typical qualitative risk assessments that we do in most organizations.
Thanks, Werner. So a quantitative risk assessment, or QRA in short, is a term that has become quite popular in many organizations. But what it really is to calculate or to determine suitable time and cost contingencies for your project estimates. Usually what we find is there's some companies that calculate contingency or just adds 10% to the bottom line. But what a quantitative risk assessment does is to calculate the amount of risk the project is exposed to, and then to indicate that in terms of duration for your schedule and for the monetary value for your capital estimate. So the difference between qualitative and quantitative risk assessments or risk management is, in terms of qualitative risk management, that is where the development of your risk register comes in. So the risk register is usually populated by subject matter experts and it indicates the probability and impact of your risks. Where quantitative risk assessments are used more, where more numerical models comes into play. So that indicates or predicts the time, the probability and the impact of risks in terms of time and cost. So there's a lot of research that shows that even the smallest quantitative methods outperforms qualitative risk management. So it's definitely something that can benefit a project. So maybe in terms of our new methodology, quantitative risk assessment methodology that ProjectLink developed, maybe Werner, you can tell us more about that and what's new within Quant.
Yes, Marlies. So what we have done is we've been doing quantitative risk assessments for the past nearly 6 years. We've performed nearly 200 quantitative risk assessments, and we've learned many lessons, over those years about quantitative risk assessments. What we have done over the past year is to formalize all those lessons learned into a methodology that we now call the QUANT methodology, obviously quantitative methodology, linked to that. And we specifically went out and looked at organizations that are in the non-engineering spaces. So we for example, looked at US Department of Defense and the methods that they use. So they would obviously have some construction type projects, engineering type projects, but they also do software projects, other types of projects. We looked at NASA, at their standards and their methodologies. And then we also looked extensively at how quantitative methods are used in the financial services, because quantitative risk assessments actually come from financial services. The first places where quantitative risk and statistics was used historically was in insurance. Before that, it was gambling, and then it's quite similar actually. Then into insurance, and for project management, it's only been really around for the past decade or so, perhaps 2 decades, that people have been using quantitative methods. So in our methodology, we have developed 3 parts to the methodology, or there are 3 parts to the methodology. The first part is where we do quantitative risk assessments on the project business case. Now, that is where you develop a financial model, and the typical outputs from a financial model would be things like a net present value, internal rate of return, payback periods, those typical financial parameters. But when financial models are developed, those numbers tend to be fixed numbers or discrete numbers. And what we do in a quantitative risk assessment is a probabilistic analysis of that business case. So instead of having a single number, you can now get a whole range of numbers at different probabilities. So that's how our methodology then would be applied to financial business case. Of course, there's a lot of detail behind that. I'm just mentioning some of the highlights here. Then we also revised our methodology for project risk management, where we look at the project schedule, the project cost estimate, the project risk register, and so on, where we bring all of those things together. And then the third area that we also developed in this methodology now is contingency management. So that is, once we have done those contingency calculations and the project goes into execution, is the management and the control of contingency to ensure that contingency is applied at the right places for those elements that the contingency is actually intended for. So that's what we covered in the methodology. So it's a lot wider and a lot more formalized in terms of the 3 areas. What we've also formalized a bit better is what we call the 4 pillars of quantitative risk assessments. And the first pillar for us is where we look at cost estimation. The second pillar is the development of project schedules. The third pillar is the project risk register. And we'll talk a bit more about the risk register and some of these other models as well. And then the 4th pillar for us is systemic risk assessments. And for systemic risk assessments, we actually did quite a bit of additional research to what we had in the past, specifically learning a bit from the financial services industry. So those are the elements that are in the quant methodology. So how that helps us then is to go through the process a lot more smoothly. It also helps us to inform clients better as to what they have to do. And one of the other upsides, of course, is it gives a lot more transparency. So if you get a number for contingency of, let's say, 20% or 15%, the methodology works in such a way that it is not a black box. You can actually look backwards and see exactly where that variation comes from, and then you can go and address those things if you want to. So it gives a high level of transparency, which was not always that easy to do in the previous methodology that we had. So we've also improved on the methods that we use to collect data, because this whole methodology is really based on what kind of information do we get from clients. But I think perhaps if you can comment on that, because your day-to-day activities are really linked to doing these quantitative risk assessments, and I know that there are some difficulties that you guys have with collecting data.
So yes, Werner, that's definitely one of the challenges we encounter during the process of conducting a QRA, is to collect the data. One of the major challenges are that sometimes clients come to us within the same week that a project needs to go for review, and they want us to conduct a QRA. But unfortunately, it's not as easy as just a black box, like you mentioned. So, and that short notice inevitably puts the QRA at risk. So, the updates that we've done in Quant is to take the project team through the process and to guide them through the process to be able to collect the correct and to collect high quality data during the process, because the quality of the data is also one of the challenges we have, specifically with things like a risk register. That's one of the main inputs that we require for the QRA, but sometimes project teams don't even have a risk register. So we can assist them to develop a risk register while we go through the process of a QRA, but the ideal is to collect that risk data as you go through the process of your study through engineering, all the processes you go through to collect and to design. So the ideal is that you develop that risk register as you go through the process, but that doesn't necessarily happen. So, but one of the other inputs is also the systemic risk. So maybe if you can tell us a bit more about the systemic risk model specifically.
Yeah, so in our systemic risk model, it's a model that we developed quite a number of years ago, and we've been using that. And the systemic risk model is a bit new to quantitative risk assessments, in many cases. And I think in terms of our own development of that model, we are leading a lot of the thinking and the methods on systemic risk management in terms of collection of systemic risk data and the probabilistic analysis of the risk data. So what we mean by systemic risk, they are risks that are difficult to pinpoint as specific risk events in your project risk register. And one of the typical examples that we have in our systemic risk assessment is the speed of decision making of management in an organization. So that is something that is difficult to quantify exactly as a discrete risk, but we know it has a big influence on projects. How fast decisions can be made if there are scope changes, for example, or schedule changes, or critical things that must be decided. And our experience there has been that, in general, people experience in companies that decision-making takes quite long. Some of the other factors that we look at are socioeconomic factors. We also look at the integration of the project team. If there are multiple teams, that integration becomes more difficult. We look at the technical complexity as well. So those are all some of the elements that we use in our systemic risk assessment. So what we do with systemic risk is we try to capture those things that would not be captured in your cost estimate, in your project schedule, in your risk register. But from research, we know that systemic risks are often the reason for what's termed spectacular project failures. So if we look at the literature, that's actually the term that's used. So if you see spectacular failures, they're often not because somebody counted the number of devices that they require in the cost estimate. They counted that incorrectly, or that the project schedule, a task that should have been 2 weeks is now 4 weeks. I mean, those things are typically not the big disasters, or would not lead to the big disasters. So in our updated methodology, we've revisited our systemic risk assessment. And that systemic risk assessment, where we in the past used it mainly for cost estimation, or a portion of the cost estimation, we also use it now for the schedule. And then as I said earlier, the systemic risk is one of the pillars that we use. The methodology behind it is primarily benchmark based. So we've collected data from the industry over multiple years, and we benchmark the projects against that data for different industries, different project types, and so on. And then that gets integrated into the complete model. So our experience over the past few years has been that systemic risks are extremely valuable to assess. They add a lot of value to project teams to understand how well they've defined the project scope. They also help them to go back, if they're in early study phases, to plan differently for the next phase, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think one of the nice things is you can use them also in different phases. And I think that also brings up a question that we quite frequently get from customers is, when is the right time to do the quantitative risk assessment?
So maybe to answer that, a quantitative risk assessment or a QRA can be done anytime during early phases, but even in early execution. We've done quite a lot of QRAs in execution as well. It all depends on the amount of information that's available at that point in time. So in the earlier study phases, concept pre-phase A, pre-phase B, as some of our clients call them, only some or only high-level information will be available. There won't be a detailed work breakdown structure, there won't be a detailed execution schedule, and there might be more than one option that's a possibility to go into execution. So when the detailed information is not yet available, we usually look at systemic risk models and detailed, well, as detailed as that is available at that point in time, risk registers. But as the study or as the project progresses during the study phases and the more detailed becomes available, the more detailed information we get, then we look at the 4 pillars that you mentioned. So then we look at the detailed cost estimate, we look at the detailed execution schedule, and then also the systemic risks and the risk register. Those 2 will be the most important items that's available usually throughout the process. One look that we also have in execution is then by then the contractor will actually be appointed. So rates will be fixed and firm, and timelines will also be fixed and firm as per the agreed contract. So what we can also then do, and I think you did mention it before, is then to assist the team, the contingency that is calculated at that point in time, the contingency will be reevaluated. And the contingency will also be calculated for the remaining scope of the work that still needs to be done by that time in execution. But we can also assist the project team to manage that contingency, because what usually happens is provision is made for specific risk areas in the project for contingency, and contingency is just used for scope changes and different things that happen. But by the time that money is actually required for a risk that has materialized, the contingency bucket is empty. So we can assist the project team also to manage that contingency and to ensure that it's used for what it was allocated for. So maybe if we look at different project sizes, if you can maybe explain how QRAs are done for different sizes of projects, and if there's a difference.
So yeah, that's a question we frequently get from companies that we work with. Is the project not too small? Should it only be done for large projects? Or what's the criteria that should be used for doing a quantitative risk assessment? So I think, unfortunately, the way these things go, and because we're dealing with uncertainty and probabilistic models, there aren't hard and fast rules about it. But some of the guidelines that we've seen work well for companies is to look at complexity. So when you have even small projects, low-cost projects, or sometimes even no-cost projects, if it's an internal project to the organization, but the complexity is high, understanding the risk becomes quite important, because that drives decision-making, and we'll talk a little bit more about decision-making later. So complexity is definitely one of the drivers, and in our definition of complexity, that would be if there are multiple systems, multiple departments, multiple people, multiple different contractors involved, etc. So that all leads to complexity in the project. So that's one area where quantitative risk assessments would definitely help. On the other side of that, large projects, large capital projects, usually benefit from quantitative risk assessment, even if they're not complex. And simply because the value to the organization is so big that if the project fails or overruns substantially, the impact on the business can be quite significant. So doing quantitative risk assessments on large value projects is also recommended, just to understand where the risk lies, how one can control the risk, and so on. So linked to that as well is contracting models. And that's something that we often find clients struggle with, is the way they actually contract the work. And I think in some industries there's a tendency to use models, to use contracting models like remeasurable models. In some other industries, you would typically get lump sum turnkey type projects. In some software projects, you'll get time material projects. So the experience that we have there is that when procurement strategies or contracting strategies are decided on, the organization must understand where the risk lies. So if you have a remeasurable contract, the bulk of the risk immediately lies with the owner company, because variations in quantities would typically then be for their account. Whereas if it's a lump sum turnkey project, the owner company would be protected to a large extent from risk. There's never no risk, but there's more risk on the contractor side. So in a scenario like that, one would actually want to see that the contractor, the EPC, EPCM supplier, the vendor, that they would do the quantitative risk assessment, because that will also help them to understand better what their risk profile looks like, and it will of course give some confidence to the client. So I think those things are quite important. What we also bring in with the whole idea behind complexity, contracting models, and so on is the different methods that are used in the different phases. So the 4 pillars that we spoke about, so that's the cost estimate, the schedule, the risk register, and the systemic risk, they are not weighted equally in the different phases. So one would apply them, one would give more focus to different areas depending on where you are. So for example, if you're in an early study phase, let's say you're doing a conceptual study where you only have a rough idea what the scope is, you haven't developed the detailed costing or schedule yet, then a systemic risk assessment is extremely useful to understand the sources of risk and the potential magnitude of risk once you get into execution. As you progress, once you get to a feasibility study, then you should have a detailed cost estimate, a detailed schedule, etc. And if you don't, then there's obviously something wrong with your project. I think one should also be careful on where you put the focus, because the experience that we've had, and also what we see from research in other organizations, is that we often find that companies, when they calculate contingencies, they will look at the cost estimate. So the cost estimate becomes the primary driver of how big the contingency should be. But if we look at many examples and the research that's been done, the smallest contributor to variation is actually the cost estimate. Just because the methods that are used for cost estimation are generally quite well developed, the people who do that are actually well skilled, and the level of variation that we get there is quite low. The big items that really cause projects to overrun or significant risk would be the project schedule, because if the schedule starts to overrun, everybody is affected, the risk register, and the systemic risk as well. So, but as we move through those phases, in our methodology, we have guidelines on how to weigh the different parts of those 4 pillars, and how to use that. And I think, I think you can also comment on the different users of quantitative risk assessment, because we do deal with companies that are EPCM or contractor type companies. So on EPCM, it would be more on the construction engineering type projects. For other types of projects, it may be referred to as vendors, contractors, etc. But that supplier of that service versus the owner teams.
So maybe if we look at the supplier or the vendor or the EPCM view first. So for them, it's important to do a QRA to see what level the engineering is currently at. And we usually also see that it gives their tender submission, if the tender is applicable, it gives their tender a competitive edge. And it also gives the owner company or the client a bit more confidence in the tender's or the supplier's submission. Whereas from the view of the owner company, it's usually to confirm their funding or to validate their funding, but also to see how much risk the company is exposed to. So I think although it's a bit of a different view between the two sides, the benefits of doing a QRA is really wide. So in terms of doing a QRA for both, I mean it's really beneficial.
Yeah, so I think if I can also perhaps comment a little bit on where QRAs lead us to, because I think what companies sometimes do is they do QRAs for the sake of doing the QRA because somebody said they must do it. But the quantitative risk assessment is a valuable contributor to decision making in an organization. And how we've also changed our methodology now in the kickoff meeting that we have with the client at the very start of the quantitative risk assessment. One of the items that we document is the decision frame. So we want to understand at the very beginning from a client, whether the client is a contractor or whether the company doing the actual project, what the decisions are, or the single decision or multiple decisions that they want to make. So we try to understand the decision frame, because that also guides us in terms of the quantitative risk assessment. So one can go through it very mechanistically, can do the quantitative risk assessment, give the answers, but you can't add more value if you don't understand what people want to do with it. But what we have seen is on projects where we are involved in the decision-making process as well, we often do things differently. We focus on specific items and so on. So when we talk about decision-making, the aim for decision-making in general is not to make perfect decisions, because you only know whether you've made a perfect decision after some consequence. So if you decide to go on holiday to some place and you arrive there and you really hate it, you only know it when you hate it, when you get there. So there isn't something like a perfect decision, but there is something like a high quality decision. And there's a lot of research on that, around decision making, the psychology of decision making, the data collection that leads to decision making, or that are the inputs into it in group decision making and so on. That actually leads us to believe and to focus on high quality decisions. So when you look at a high quality decision, there are multiple parameters, but perhaps if I just talk about two. The first one is you must know what the decision is you want to make. So that must be very clear, your decision frame. And then secondly, the data that you collect to make the decision. So we can only really make better quality decisions when we have the right data. So humans in general are really bad at decision making, but when we have more data, that helps us. It doesn't give you a perfect decision, as I said, but it helps you. So the QRA and the outputs they get to the QRA, in terms of projects, whether you should do a project or not, or whether you should use a specific technology or not, whether you should use a particular contractor, those kind of project or portfolio level questions, they can be answered on gut feel, and people often do that, or people mostly do that. But the quantitative risk assessment gives you that certainty that you are dealing with numbers where you can say, if I want to be 80% certain about my delivery time, the quantitative risk assessment tells me this. Or if I want to finish within a particular time, the quantitative risk assessment will tell me what the probability is of actually finishing in that time. So it's extremely informative in terms of our decision-making process. And so that helps quite a lot in decision-making. Something that we also picked up in the research is perhaps linked a little bit to decision-making, but also how quantitative risk assessments will in all likelihood happen when we go into the future. So, and I think, we've been talking about quantitative risk assessment mainly in the context of the projects that organizations will do, but one can use quantitative risk assessment for anything. You can use it for your own decisions. And perhaps if I can just add that in there, and I think you spoke about it in the beginning, what we see from the research is that even using very simple quantitative methods will improve your decision-making ability substantially. And to extend that example, let's say you like to drink wine when you go to a restaurant, and each time you get there, you remember the previous time, you say to yourself, what did I pick the last time? I like this kind of wine. And you have the wine and after you say, shit, I'm a bit disappointed, yeah. It's like that holiday, I guess. So what we see with the decisions that are even that simple is if you take historical information on the kind of wine that you picked and how much you liked it, and even if you just draw a straight line through it, simple quantitative model, a linear model, that model will actually outperform your decision-making ability if you just go on your gut feel or your own memory. So So there's a lot of research that just shows that even simple quantitative methods can improve our decision making substantially. So what we see going into the future is that we need data to make better decisions, and more with over the past decade or so, where big data is so important, we find that, and we've done some experiments ourselves as well, that we've built some models around that, where we use machine learning methods to parameterize our input data, to train the networks or the neural network, and then to feed it with parameters of a future project that we want to do. And it's actually amazing the kind of results you get, because they immediately remove a lot of the biases that you get from people, and the level of decision making, especially with multiple parameters, lots of parameters, more than humans can deal with. So let's say you've got a list of 60 parameters that you want to look at when you do projects. Using machine learning techniques, it's quite easy to use that. For a human to remember 60 things is it's hardly possible to do that. And so I think, so those are some of the things around decision making, what we see going into the future. So I think perhaps if I can just summarize, just looking at the time here as well, I think there are three things for us that stand out from the research we've done over the past year, from the development or the updates on the methodology, from talking to multiple people, reading lots of books. There are three things that really stand out. The first one is that quantitative methods always outperform qualitative methods. So qualitative methods would be a stepping stone to get you a quantitative method. So it's still a good idea to do the qualitative risk assessment. But if you use a qualitative risk assessment or a risk register to drive your decision making, you're not going to get great decisions, where quantitative methods helps a lot to get that right. So I think that's one of the things that really stand out for us. The second thing is we have to use multiple aspects of analyzing the uncertainty, because what we're really dealing with is uncertainty. And when we build models, those models are never perfect, but they give us some lens of the uncertainty. So the more lenses you have to look at the uncertainty, the more clear the picture becomes. And I think that's quite important, is to use those different models. So we've got the four models: the cost, the schedule, the risk, and the systemic risk. And we're not saying by any means it's perfect or it's the final model. We're also working on that. As we go along, we're continuously doing research on that. But we know that using those the four areas definitely outperforms any of the previous models we had in the past, where we had single models, double models, etc., etc. So that's the second thing. And then the last one, which is kind of the obvious one, you need good data. So and we sometimes have this experience, is if you've got a bad estimate and a bad schedule, the quantitative risk assessment is not going to fix that for you. You're just going to get a bad output. And it may look wonderful because you've done a Monte Carlo simulation and the word gets used by people, to give that illusion of we've done some science here. But eventually it will come through that the input data was not reliable. So I think those are the three main things that we've learned through the research over the past year. We're still continuing, but all of those things have been built into the new methodology, and we've already seen some wonderful results from the parts that we've used. So I think I see there are some questions. Perhaps if you want to have a look at some of those questions.
So maybe let's ask the first question. Can a QRA be split between parts of the same project? So maybe Vanna, if you want to answer that.
Yes. Yeah, we can definitely do that. And I think when we look at splitting the QRA, if you can draw a picture in your mind, we can either split it horizontally by saying within the project, there could be different parts of that project. Let us say you have a construction project or large engineering project. On the one side, you've got the process plant or processing plant, and on the other side, you've got infrastructure. There are different techniques that one can use. So you can split in terms of the four pillars and how you apply those pillars on the horizontal scale. You can also use it in the same picture on the vertical scale, where you may have a project where parts of the project are at different points within your project lifecycle. So a part of the project may be in like a pre-feasibility stage, and part of the project may be in a feasibility stage. So we can also stage it like that, but you'll do 2 QRAs because you've got different levels of uncertainty. So that's as part of our initial information collection and our initial kickoff meeting, we'll usually collect that information to understand whether the QRA must be split up.
Can be split.
Yeah.
Thank you. We hope we've answered that. So the next question from Hannes, what are the required inputs for a QRA? So if we look at the specific input documentation, so for the 4 pillars, if we look at the capital estimate, the main document or the main input for the CapEx QRA is the capital estimate. So ideally we will need, we also need a basis of estimate that is not usually available by the time we do the QRA. For the second portion or for the second pillar, it's the project schedule. So we need a detailed execution schedule. Ideally also resource loaded to be able to map the schedule, the packages within the schedule to the estimate to be able to calculate time-related P's and G's. And also ideal would be the basis of estimate, but as I mentioned, for the basis of estimate, the basis of schedule is also not usually available by the time we do the QRA. The third input is the risk register. As I mentioned, we can assist the team to develop the risk register, but it's ideal to have that development done throughout the process. Then any project-related information that can be submitted as part of that input will assist us in the assessment. Things like the work breakdown structure or detailed scope of work will also assist us. So there's no specific, for the 4th pillar, for systemic risk, there's no specific input data. So we take you through that process to collect the information on this systemic risk data as well. Okay, so the next question, can a QRA be done online or virtually? So I think if I can answer that, so yes, we've definitely seen in the past 18 months that QRAs or quantitative risk assessments can definitely be done online or virtually. It saves a lot of time. The project team members can be in different parts of the world, as we've seen in some cases. So yes, I wouldn't say that it affects the quality of the QRA. So I think it just makes the process a bit different, but it can definitely be done online. So another question, what is the typical timeline of a QRA? So maybe if I can
I think you should answer that.
Also answer that. So usually smaller, non-complex projects, it usually takes us 3 days, about 3 days to after we've had the workshop. So usually we take 1 day to collect all the information or the data from the project team. After we've reviewed it, we usually have a workshop to go through the risk register, to allocate the ranges to the capital estimate, to allocate the ranges to the schedule, and to go through the systemic risk. So for relatively small, uncomplex projects, we can provide prelim results within 3 to 4 days. But if it's quite a big project, big complex project that's big in capital value, it usually takes about a week to be able to finalize those models, to integrate them, to run the simulations, and to prepare prelim results. So after we've submitted the results to the project team for review, after the results are accepted, usually takes about 3 to 4 days to finalize the detailed QRA report. So The results that we submit, or the prelim results we submit, is quite detailed. So there's a lot of information in there with graphs and detailed tables. So the final QRA report is just the write-up of all the methods and the processes we went through, and a bit more detail on the statistics. So I hope that answered your question.
So I see there's a, well, perhaps if I can comment on the poll. There was a poll that we posted at the start of the session, and with a few questions. So the question, there are a few answers, but one question: what is the biggest negative impact on projects you're involved in? So, and the options were scope changes, inaccurate schedules, incorrect cost estimation, something else, or management indecision, and also contractor skills. So one person said something else. I think it'll be interesting to know what that something else is. But what we see from the poll is that the majority, 60% of the people of course, in this session, the answer said scope changes. So I think the interesting thing about a scope change is that that contingency on a project should not be used to fund scope changes, because contingency is based on what we know about the project, and we don't know about scope changes until they happen or until they're requested. So using contingency for scope changes means that we're using money that is actually risk money for something else that may still go wrong. So if you start using contingency in the early stages of your project to fund scope changes, when that risk that you've quantified actually occurs later on, then you may not have the funds to do that. So I think the short answer is quantitative risk assessments would typically, or not typically, would not look at scope changes. However, we can give a fairly accurate prediction of whether there will be scope changes, and we can even give some indication of the magnitude of those scope changes. And the way we do that is through our systemic risk assessments. So one of the elements in our systemic risk assessment is something we call the Project Definition Rating Index. It's actually an instrument that we use that was developed by the Construction Industry Institute. And when we do that PDRI, the scoring of that PDRI is nearly always a leading indicator of how well the scope of work is understood. So by looking at that scoring, going through that questionnaire, that benchmarking process, we can usually tell you, and we've got a lot of historical information on that, whether you're going to get scope changes or not. The best advice at that point is to go back and to make sure that your scope is complete before you start the project. So you want to fund the scope that you want to execute, but using that technique as a spin-off from the quantitative risk assessment actually does give you a very, very good indication of the likelihood of having scope changes later in the project life cycle. So yeah. So Marlies, I see we don't have any more questions. And I know you want to just also say something about a voucher for those people who have attended.
So yes, thanks, Werner. Thank you very much for attending today, everyone. It was nice talking to you. So all of you will receive an email with a coupon code for our new Applied Planning and Scheduling course that we've just launched. So the course starts on 1 November. So you'll receive a coupon code that you'll be able to use to receive a discount for this course. But thank you very much for joining us. Please let us know if there's anything that we can assist you with. If you would like to contact us, please visit our website. It's www.projectlink.co.za. But thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, from my side as well, thank you very much. I see we are just over 20 people here this afternoon. I think at the same time, I also want to thank the producer, who you can't see on the screen, who made sure that all the technology is working, for facilitating this for us. But yes, as Marlies said, we really like working with these models. We have seen some really great benefits to organizations in understanding what's really going on their projects. And we believe that we can most certainly help you to understand your project risks better and to actually understand them in numbers. So thank you very much.